Thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll get started promptly at 6:30 p.m. Again, for anyone joining us a few minutes early this evening, we'll get started right at 6:30 p.m. Thanks. Just one final reminder for anyone who joined us a little bit early this evening, we'll get started in about 2 minutes, promptly at 6:30 p.m. Thank you. All right, it is 6:30 p.m., and so we're going to go ahead and begin tonight's session. Good evening, everyone. I'm Emily Waddell with the Harris County Flood Control District's communications team. Welcome to tonight's conversation. The purpose of this meeting is to inform you about 2 flood risk mitigation projects along Cypress Creek and a federal grant administered through the Texas General Land Office that could help us fund those projects. I'm joined tonight by a team of Flood Control District leadership and subject matter experts to share information and address your questions. I want to note that there are 2 ways to take part in tonight's meeting: via phone by calling 925-2801 utilizing meeting code 9184 or online at publicinput.com/Cypress Creek Basins. Please note that if you're joining tonight's session via phone, you will not be able to see the presentation, maps, or exhibits. Those items are available on the meeting website in English and in Spanish. Visit publicinput.com/Cypress Creek Basins to access those materials. Additionally, there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project or a question for our team during tonight's session. You can submit a comment or a question on the Public Input website in the box next to the presentation live stream. You're also able to submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/Cypress Creek. Finally, if you're joining us via phone this evening, please press *3 to leave a message. Any questions that are not addressed during tonight's Q&A will receive a response after the event. Additionally, after this meeting is concluded, a recording of tonight's program and presentation will be posted to the Cypress Creek website. Again, that URL is hcfcd.org/Cypress Creek. I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague Kendrick, who will have a message in Spanish.
Y en español, hay 2 formas de participar en la junta de esta noche. Por teléfono, llamando al 855-925-2801 con el código de la junta 9184 o en línea en publicinput.com/Cypress Creek Basins. Tengan en cuenta que si se unen a la sesión de hoy por teléfono, no podrán ver la presentación, los mapas ni la documentación. Esos elementos están disponibles en inglés y en español en el sitio web de la Junta. Ingresen a publicinput.com/Cypress Creek Basins para ascender a ellos. Y también existen 3 maneras de enviar un comentario sobre este proyecto durante la sesión de esta noche. 1. Pueden enviar un comentario en este sitio, en el cuadro junto de la transmisión en vivo. También pueden enviar un comentario en el sitio web del Flood Control District en hcfcd.org/TCJester o hcfcd.org/Westador. Por último, si nos acompañan por teléfono, presionen *3 para dejar un mensaje. Las preguntas que nos aborden durante la sesión de preguntas y respuestas de esta noche se responderán después del evento. Una vez que finalice esta junta, se publicará la grabación del programa y la presentación de esta noche en el sitio web en www.hcfcd.org/Cypress Creek.
Thanks, Kendrick. We will begin tonight's meeting with remarks from Harris County Precinct 4 Commissioner Cagle. After those remarks, we'll give a brief presentation about the flood mitigation projects we're investigating. This will be followed by a guided question and answer session with Flood Control District leadership and experts about the grant opportunity and these 2 projects. I'd now like to turn it over to Commissioner Cagle, who is called in to kick things off this evening.
Thank you for participating in our virtual flood control community engagement meeting today. Here we are going to discuss the CDBG-MIT grant application, and we'll hear more about that later on, for 2 stormwater basins along Cypress Creek. I think it's appropriate that we have this discussion today as data is blowing by. I want to assure you that your Harris County Precinct 4 road and bridge crews are ready and prepared to address any issue that may arise. And our Community Assistance Department is standing by to receive your calls if you have an issue or have something to report. Their phone number is 832-927-4444. That's 832-927-4444. I'd like to thank the hard-working folks of the Harris County Flood Control District today for their tireless efforts to help protect us from storm events of the future and of events such as like today. I'd also like to thank you for taking time out of your evening to participate in this meeting. Your involvement will help ensure that our community remains strong and healthy. The matters that we discuss tonight will focus on future improvements along the Cypress Creek watershed. We'll discuss active and passive approaches to how we can make sure that we mitigate flooding as best as we possibly can. I'd like to touch briefly on a partnership project that Precinct 4 has with Harris County Flood Control District, and that is the Cypress Creek Greenway, where we partner together to acquire, as a passive approach, land that allows us to have recreation when it is dry and preservation of wildlife, deer, raccoons and other little creatures, birds and plants and other animals that we get to enjoy. And it also provides us with a place for the water to go when the waters rise, so that they are not filling up in our homes. That's just one aspect of the things that we will be doing along the Cypress Creek Greenway. And this on Cypress Creek Watershed project tonight will be dealing with a couple of stormwater basins as well. Your engagement is important to us all here at Harris County, and it's a crucial part of the successful operations of the Harris County Flood Control District. Thank you again for participating.
Thanks, Commissioner Cagle. To continue the conversation, I'd like to introduce Alan Black, Director of Operations with the Flood Control District. Alan, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Emily, and thanks again to everyone for joining us this evening. I've got a lot of information to cover, so remember, you will have the opportunity to rewatch this in replay in case you missed something, but let's go ahead and jump on in. As Emily mentioned, we're here this evening to talk about an exciting opportunity to apply for federal grants through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's also known as HUD. And to construct flood damage reduction projects in your community. The grants, and specifically, are called Community Development Block Grants for Mitigation, or CDBG-MIT for short. Now, for those of you following along with the PDF via the phone, we are now moving to slide 6 of tonight's presentation.
Y para quienes están en el PDF por teléfono, vamos a pasar a la diapositiva 6 de la presentación de esta noche.
Before we get into specifics, let's set the stage. You may remember the 2018 bond election when Harris County voters overwhelmingly approved dollars to fund flood risk mitigation projects across the county. Since the bond's passing, we have initiated 144 of the 181 projects across all watersheds, and 38 of those projects were added based directly on input from you, the community. And while the bond was for $2.5 billion, the full cost of every project in the bond table was almost $5 billion. So we made it clear from the outset that we would need federal and local funding partners to fully construct the projects on the list. Without partnership funding, every project would still get started, but we may have to phase some of the work until additional funds become available. And that's really where tonight's conversation comes in. Partnership funding is a vital aspect of the 2018 bond program, and we're committed to exploring all opportunities for additional funding to further these projects across the region. The Flood Control District works continuously to identify potential funding programs, and many of those programs are shown here in what I like to call the spaghetti model of federal funding. The federal government doesn't just write us a big fat check and say, go do good work. Instead, they appropriate funding into these various programs, and then we match our proposed projects to various program requirements. And I should say those requirements are very different from one program to another. So we apply for, advocate for, and often compete against other projects for available funds. The funding source we'll discuss during tonight's session, the CDBG-MIT program, is noted on the screen with a yellow arrow. Now, CDBG-MIT funding is administered at the state level by the Texas General Land Office, or GLO. And tonight, we're reaching out for your feedback on applications we plan to submit to them. These funds are designated for mitigation activities, which are the types of projects we prioritize at the Flood Control District every day. Activities that increase resilience and help reduce long-term risks to the community. Applications to the GLO are due by the end of October, and it's important to note that there are no guarantees we will be successful. But again, we're committed to bringing as much federal funding as possible to the county. I want to emphasize that tonight's meeting is not the only time you're going to hear from flood control on these two projects. With or without CDBG mitigation funds, we'll be coming back to the community to share updates as these projects move forward into preliminary engineering and design, including more information about specific plans, exhibits, and timelines. So you can think of tonight's discussion as a bit of a high-level preview of that effort. Now, we've been actually tracking this funding since it was approved by Congress more than 2 years ago as a part of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. In total, more than $4 billion was allocated to the state of Texas and the General Land Office. After navigating the lengthy federal and state processes, those funds are finally now available for entities across the entire state to apply for, including Harris County and the Flood Control District. As you can see on the slide, we're currently in the community outreach phase, seeking feedback on proposed projects, and early next month, the draft applications themselves. Those applications are due to the GLO on October 28th of 2020. Now, here you'll see an overview of all the projects included in the CDBG-MIT applications, including the ones we're discussing tonight. We're hosting these meetings across the county to discuss these particular projects and their applications, gather feedback from residents, and continue the conversation about funding flood risk mitigation efforts across our region. I'll pause for a second and note that for those of you following along with the PDF via phone, we're now moving to slide 11 of tonight's presentation.
También en español, para quienes siguen el PDF por teléfono, vamos a pasar a la diapositiva 11 de la presentación de esta noche.
So enough about the program. Let's talk about the projects and what's going on in Cypress Creek. As with much of our region, the Cypress Creek watershed has historically experienced storm events that produce heavy rains and cause frequent flooding, like is going on tonight. Cypress Creek is also one of the most highly developed watersheds in the county, and much of that development occurred before current regulations around on-site detention were in place. This creates unique challenges when we propose flood risk reduction projects in those areas. So we recently completed a regional drainage study for the watershed and confirmed that flooding along tributaries of Cypress Creek is predominantly caused by water from a rising Cypress Creek backing up into those tributaries, not necessarily a lack of sufficient stormwater conveyance or drainage capacity on the tributaries themselves. Therefore, the study recommends nearly 25,000 acre-feet of additional stormwater detention in the Cypress Creek watershed to reduce that backwater issue. To put that into perspective for you, since the Flood Control District's creation in 1937, we've constructed approximately 50,000 acre-feet of detention countywide. So half that much again is needed in Cypress Creek. So how do we get that started? Well, we do not know of any single project can meet this need. So the Flood Control District is taking a watershed-wide approach to executing flood risk reduction projects in the Cypress Creek watershed. The Cypress Creek Implementation Program provides a holistic view of activity in the watershed and enables the Flood Control District to deliver projects strategically and efficiently in a heavily developed area. Projects will include stormwater detention basins, projects to improve the channel's ability to carry stormwater on various Cypress Creek tributaries, and right-of-way acquisition for floodplain preservation, as Commissioner Cagle mentioned earlier. To move projects quickly and efficiently, the Flood Control District is moving forward wherever possible, beginning with efforts around and on land we already own. Here on the map, you can see the two projects we're here to discuss tonight. One last thing before we dive into some specifics, I want to take a moment to explain the project lifecycle. And honestly, this is probably the most frustrating part of my job, because the average life cycle of a project is too long, anywhere between 3 and 5 years, sometimes more. But there are reasons for that. The project life cycle starts with a feasibility study to determine if there's a good project to be built. That leads to a preliminary engineering report, and after that, we can begin right-of-way acquisition, and that can take sometimes 12 to 18 months alone. We also have to secure environmental permits, which can take another 12 months. We also work through utility relocations if needed, and then complete final design, finally moving into construction, and ultimately maintaining the new infrastructure along with all of our facilities around the county. I want to emphasize that tonight will not be the only time you hear from us on these projects. Throughout each stage of that project lifecycle, we solicit community input and secure funding opportunities to make these projects a reality, including the opportunity we're discussing tonight. The projects included in these grant applications are in different stages and are moving forward on their own timelines, which may be impacted by funding availability. Further, it's worth noting that even if we are successful in obtaining grant funding for each of these projects, there are still more steps we need to complete. If we do not receive grant funding for either or both of these projects, then the timing of the project becomes a little more uncertain and that life cycle may be impacted. So both of the projects we plan to discuss this evening are stormwater detention basins, as I mentioned, which are a big part of our approach in the Cypress Creek watershed. Stormwater basins are a place to store potentially damaging floodwaters temporarily until the channels can safely carry the water away. As flat as Harris County is, most of our stormwater storage has to be excavated. Now, the Flood Control District uses stormwater detention extensively to reduce the risk of flooding throughout the county. The detention basins we build are typically large regional facilities, which may be several hundred acres in size. However, other kinds of detention exist as well. For example, new developments are required to mitigate the effects of their development, often in the form of stormwater detention. When full, detention basins often resemble lakes, and when dry, they're simply large open spaces. So, let's turn to those specific projects included in the applications. For those of you following along with the PDF via phone, we're now moving to slide 15 of tonight's presentation.
Y para quienes siguen el PDF por teléfono, vamos a pasar a la diapositiva 15 de la presentación de esta noche.
Now, as mentioned previously, as part of our approach in the Cypress Creek watershed, the Flood Control District is prioritizing projects on property it already owns, which is the case here. This helps to speed up the project lifecycle I just mentioned. The Flood Control District owns approximately 170 acres of land at TC Jester and Cypress Creek, south of Cypresswood Drive, and on both sides of TC Jester. And we are planning to use this site for stormwater detention. Now, the efforts on this site are split into two concurrent projects. One project will be on the west side of TC Jester, as shown here. Now, this is unrelated to the proposed CDBG-MIT grant application, but we thought you'd find it interesting to see how we're using the tools we have available to run as many concurrent activities as possible. On this side, we plan to begin rough grading excavation in the next few months through our excavation and removal program. Now, this is a program where we allow a contractor to excavate at their discretion within a certain footprint. This is a program where we'll allow the within a set footprint based on their business model of selling fill material. The material is excavated at little to no cost to the district and allows excavation to get started now, while the overall engineering design and optimization of the ultimate facility are still being worked out. Now, we had hoped to start this earlier, a couple of months earlier, but we're still working out with the details on our environmental permits with the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has slowed that progress down a little, but we are optimistic that we'll be able to start very soon. So on the other side of TC Jester is where the project for our application tonight is for. The program we're submitting for has a maximum grant amount of $10 million, and that's exactly what we're going to ask for. Any additional costs to complete it will come from either the bond or our regular CIP or other partnership opportunities. To further help speed this process up, we already have a consultant on board preparing a preliminary engineering report. As you'll remember from the project lifecycle graphic I shared earlier, this is the stage when engineers examine and model alternatives for the project. In this case, we're looking at different possible layouts of the stormwater detention basin, and these alternatives balance needed stormwater detention with a myriad of other considerations, such as environmental elements, recreation, and other community values. During this stage that we're currently in, the Flood Control District will schedule a bond community engagement meeting, which in this case will likely happen early next year. This is when we'll walk the public through the alternatives and talk in more detail about our recommendation for this site to get your feedback. At the end of the stage, the report will be finalized, inclusive of your community feedback and the engineer's recommendation, and presented to Commissioners Court for authorization to proceed with final design and ultimately construction. Again, we've started this at our own cost in advance of the CDBG-MIT grant in the hopes that we can further speed up this process. So now we're going to shift over to the Westador Stormwater Detention Basin, the next project we plan to discuss. A project that's really near and dear to my heart, as I actually used to live in Westador on Lodge Hill Lane. So it's an exciting opportunity for me. It was a long time ago that we lived there back in the 80s, and it's neat to get back and see what's going on there. So the goal for this project is also to construct a stormwater detention basin on the main stem of Cypress Creek. As you can see on the screen, the Flood Control District owns a good chunk of property along Cypress Creek in the Westador area, and just next to that is the land owned by the Westador Mud. Our vision for this project is to combine the properties owned by each agency to construct a detention basin that could hold as much as 500 acre-feet of detention. Westador Mud has been great to work with the last few months, and we're close to completing an interlocal agreement to allow this project to move forward. We will be selecting a consultant soon to prepare the preliminary engineering report, again, trying to get out ahead of it and start what we can while we see if the grant application is successful. And as with the TC Jester Basin, there will be community outreach during this important planning stage to make sure that we incorporate feedback from the community as well as the Westador Mud in this project. If we combine this project with the TC Jester Stormwater Detention Basin we discussed a moment ago, we have the potential to provide nearly 1,000 acre-feet of detention for the Cypress Creek watershed. That helps us take a pretty good step towards the ultimate need of 25,000 acre-feet needed all along Cypress Creek. And the only way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time, and these two projects will be two decently big bites in that process. So we've hinted at them a little bit already, but let's talk about the numbers. As I've mentioned, we're seeking a $10 million grant funding for each of these two projects. That's $10 million for TC Jester and $10 million for Westador, for a total of $20 million of grant funding for projects in the Cypress Creek watershed. The programs we're submitting these applications are limited actually to those impacted by the disasters of 2015 and 2016, which we think increases our chances of success. So we're really optimistic about our approach for these two projects and are excited about the potential funding. Now, before we move into the Q&A portion of tonight's meeting, I want to echo our earlier conversation about timing for these two projects. The immediate next step for both projects is to submit those grant applications, and while the application is under review, the project lifecycle will continue to move forward. As mentioned, CDBG-MIT grant funding would fund the construction stage for both of these projects. I also want to reiterate again that these two projects are moved forward on separate timelines. If we do not receive grant funding for these projects, then timing of each project becomes a little more uncertain and the overall life cycle may be extended. But honestly, I never want to put a design up on a shelf, so we'll be working hard to move both forward one way or another. It just illustrates the importance and urgency of this grant opportunity. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Emily.
Thanks so much, Alan. As we've discussed, the Flood Control District would like to prepare and submit an application for grant funds, Alan mentioned, to help construct the two flood damage reduction projects we've discussed this evening. As Alan mentioned, even if we're not selected, there is funding to help get these efforts underway, and any grant funds received will be added to that, not replaced by it. Before we kick off the Q&A, I want to do two things. First, I want to remind you, building off of what Alan said, that we want to hear from you on this project, both of these projects and other efforts that are happening across the county as well. You can visit the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/Cypress Creek to learn more about these two projects, as well as a lot of other activity happening across the area. Additionally, we will have more information about the CDBG-MIT grant application process and progress projects that are included in each application on the Flood Control District website. You'll be able to see exactly what we're submitting during the formal comment period, and you'll be able to submit comments on that as well. So that will be open during a formal comment period that is to come. Additionally, I want to share a reminder of the 3 ways to submit a comment about the project during tonight's session. You can submit a comment on the public input website in the box next to the presentation live stream. You can also submit a comment on the Flood Control District website at hcfcd.org/Cypress Creek. And finally, if you're joining us via phone this evening, you can press *3 to leave a voicemail comment. Any questions or comments not addressed during tonight's question and answer session will receive a response after the event. After this meeting is concluded, I do want to reassure folks a recording of tonight's program and the presentation will both be posted to the Flood Control District's website, specifically the Cypress page, at hcfcd.org/Cypress Creek. We'll also have those materials available on each of the 2 project pages for TC Jester and Westador as well. And I want to turn it over to Kendrick to give these instructions in Spanish one more time as well.
Y de nuevo, antes de empezar, existen 3 maneras de enviar un comentario sobre este proyecto durante la sesión de esta noche. Pueden enviar un comentario en este sitio, en el cuadro junto a la transmisión en vivo. También pueden enviar un comentario en el sitio web del Flood Control District en hcfcd.org/Cypress Creek. Por último, si nos acompañan por teléfono, presionen *3 para dejar un mensaje. Las preguntas que no se aborden durante la sesión de preguntas y respuestas de esta noche se responderán después del evento. Una vez que finalice esta junta, se publicará la grabación del programa y la presentación de esta noche en el sitio web de Cypress Creek en www.hcfcd.org/Cypress Creek.
Thanks so much, Kendrick. And now I want to kick off our the Q&A portion of tonight's meeting. Joining Alan for this conversation, we have Hani Malik, Tawana Cooper, and Jonathan St. Romain, all of whom will be addressing your questions as they're coming in. So Alan, I'm going to kick things off with you. We had a question from Richard Murphy. He said, we said that CDBG-MIT funds would pay for the construction on these 2 projects. Can you talk about who will pay for the engineering and design?
Well, first, Director Murphy, thanks for joining us tonight. I'm glad you were able to tune in. We did say that we intend to use the CDBG funding for construction. So flood control will use our funds to start the design, and that again allows us to kickstart that process. Otherwise, if we wanted to use CDBG funds for the design, we would have to wait for the grant. And the grant application goes in at the end of October. It may be sometime well into next year before we actually have a grant under our belt to be able to move forward with construction. So we don't want to waste that time. We thought we'd go ahead and fund the design using flood control bond funds and then free up that $10 million grant for construction alone.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. Jonathan, I'm going to send our next question to you. It's from Paul Fabian. He says, of the 25,000 acre-feet goal for the watershed, how much is already moving forward?
Yeah, so these 2 projects are actually kind of first in line of that 25,000. And so in addition to these 2, we've got a couple more that are right behind it. So in our project life cycle, you could say they're in the feasibility stage or the very beginning of our project development stage. So of the 25,000 already underway or moving forward, I would say somewhere between the 500 to maybe 1,500 acre feet of that.
Perfect. Thanks so much for clarifying that for us, Jonathan. Alan, I'm going to come back to you for our next question, which is specifically about the grant. Can you talk about when it will be awarded, and will both TC Jester and Westador be awarded together or separately?
So both good questions. Honestly, we don't really know, but we can speculate. These programs that we're submitting for are smaller programs compared to the bigger pot of funding that is also out for applications. It's our understanding that the applications for these programs will be reviewed first. If that's the case, then we're hopeful again that we should start hearing about a successful grant application around the beginning of next year. The bigger programs won't really be available until maybe even into the summer of next year. But we're optimistic that we'll be able to hear word fairly soon. I don't know if they'll be awarded together or separately. There'll be separate applications, so there's a pretty good chance we may hear at separate timeframes as to whether or not we've been successful.
Thanks, Alan. Jonathan, I'm going to come back to you for our next question. Can you talk about any detention basins that are being planned for any areas near Champion Forest?
Sure. So we appreciate the question. And I think many are aware that we are looking into a potential detention basin on the old Ravenel Country Club grounds. And so you can find detailed detention or detailed information on our Champion Stormwater Detention Basin on our website, www.hcfcd.org/champions. Currently, the Flood Control District is in conversations with the Cypress Forest Public Utility District as to how this project will move forward. And so you can sign up for updates on that Champions Detention Basin webpage. So the answer to that question is yes, we are looking into detention in the Cypress Forest area.
Great. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Alan, I'm going to come back to you for our next one. Someone's saying there are natural surface trails in the parcels along TC Jester. Will the Flood Control District work with local partners to ensure that a cohesive and extensive trail network is maintained post-construction?
So the answer is yes, but I want to make sure that we emphasize that local partner element of it. So the Flood Control District is not able, we cannot spend our own money on trails, for example, but we frequently work with partners, work with sponsors to incorporate where we can certain elements that the community is looking for. And that's a big part of meetings like this and the community engagement meetings for the bond program that we'll be kicking off next year, is to find out what's important to the public, and if certain things are considered vitally important, to work with potential sponsors. So let's talk about recreation and trails. If there's a desire to have, if they were paved trails, for example, then we would work with who is ever willing to fund those trails, whether that's the Precinct 4, whether that's the local municipal utility district. And so what we would do is throughout the development of the project, try and identify where some footprint would be available for those recreational elements. But remember, we also have to balance that with our core mission, which is to build flood damage reduction projects that work. And so anytime that we take away from a footprint of a basin, that reduces the volume of the basin. So if there was a desire to have really wide trails around the TC Jester Basin, that might reduce the volume from 500 acre feet down to 300 acre feet. That's exactly why we do the preliminary engineering report, is to look at those alternatives to see how we can best find that balance between what our mission is and what the community wants in their area.
Thanks, Alan. I think that's an important nuance to all of this. Tawana, I'm going to come back to you, or come over to you for our next question. We've had a question just about some of the investigations that go into the project planning process, specifically around the environmental side of things. Can you talk about what's been done on these parcels in particular? And then, Alan, I think it'd be great to have you talk at a high level about how we approach these types of investigations.
Yes, thank you. Okay, concerning the Westerdor project, this project is in the very preliminary stage, and our projects do take into consideration migratory bird program requirements by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but those particular actions related to migratory bird survey are generally performed prior to clearing related to construction, not unless we have reason to believe that there are migratory birds in the area before that time. And the same would apply to the TC Jester project that is underway. It is in the preliminary engineering stage, and the migratory bird program requirements will be taken into consideration for that project also at the appropriate time, which is before we do any clearing for the project.
Great. Thanks so much, Tawana. Alan, did you want to add anything to that kind of at the overall level?
Sure. Let me add a little bit. So what Tawana talked about was how we make sure that we don't impact potential migratory birds before we start to clear a site. But long before that, we conduct a multitude of other studies to determine what's on that property and to make sure that if there are any impacts, that we appropriately mitigate those. And a couple of the highlights include wetlands. So, for example, the Corps of Engineers regulates any impacts to jurisdictional wetlands as part of the Clean Water Act. Wetlands help to filter water and make sure that the water that continues downstream is a little bit cleaner. And so we can't impact those without offsetting those with some mitigation somewhere. So during the PER, we'll identify where any jurisdictional wetlands are. Some of the other things we look at are archaeological studies. A lot of places along Cypress Creek do have ancient prehistoric artifacts that need to be preserved, and so we have scientists that will go out and take a look, find out where those things might be, and then do what we need to do with the Texas Historical Commission to make sure those are protected. And then also any other elements that are on the site. For example, we've had projects where there have been bald eagles nests, and they, of course, are federally protected. And so there's different requirements that we have to follow. All of those things are vetted out during that preliminary engineering process, which is why that's so important. Again, it slows down progress on the project itself, but we have to make sure that we're taking the right steps at the right time, so we're not impacting something that we look back later and say, oops, I wish I hadn't done that.
Thanks, Alan and Tawana. Tawana, I'm actually going to come back to you for our next one. We've had a question about sort of if this funding comes through, when these basins will be completed.
If the funding comes through, we anticipate it may come through in 2021, and it generally takes about for the Westador Basin, for example, we would have a PER which could take about 6 months, and then about another 6 months for design. So we could possibly be looking at construction in 2022 if the funding comes through. And then for the TC Jester Basin, we're anticipating completing the PER during the early summer of 2021. And then design would take approximately 6 months. So we'd be looking at 2022 possibly for that one also.
Thanks, Tawana. Jonathan, back over to you for our next one. Someone has asked what the possibility is of a detention basin on the east side of I-45 at Cypress Creek. They say that there is vacant land for sale.
So yes, that is a possibility, and of course we won't speak to any specific tracts of land or pieces of or acquisitions that we're looking into, but even before we began this Cypress Creek program implementation plan, since the 2018 bond program passed, we've begun a pretty sizable effort for right-of-way acquisition all along Cypress Creek, all up and down the watershed. Purchasing land or attempting to purchase land for, at the very least, the purpose of floodplain preservation. And so now, Alan spoke earlier on, or a little bit on the Cypress Creek program implementation plan. A large component of this implementation plan is to take some of this right-of-way acquisition effort and put all of these little puzzle pieces together of land that we can purchase and see where it makes the most sense to take these floodplain preservation tracts and turn them into detention basins. And so I think that's a long way of saying, yes, there's a possibility for something east of I-45, and that is something that we are looking into in our Cypress Creek program implementation plan.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Alan, back to the grant applications and the bigger picture of that. Can you give a sense of the benefit area for these projects and how many people could potentially be benefited?
So we're still working on the exact limits of where these benefits are. We do recognize that there are some good water surface elevation reductions for both the Westador and the TC Jester Basin. But this is also where I get back to that overall need of the watershed. And that is, we're not going to be able to build the 25,000 acre feet in one single place. It needs to be all up and down. And so we'll be constantly looking for ways to further expand these basins, to acquire additional right-of-way upstream and downstream of both of those basins and build more detention. And so we tend to look more at the overall benefits once the entire program is built, where with that 25,000 acre feet, we'd be able to better handle close to a 100-year level of service along main stem Cypress Creek.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Alan. I'm going to stay with you for our next question. We've had a question come through asking, using the map that we showed of the overall watershed, what does that 25,000 acre feet of storage look like? In other words, how much land mass could that potentially cover? That might be a tough one on the fly, but.
Sure, that's okay. Well, it starts by understanding what an acre foot is. So an acre foot is kind of what it sounds like. It is 1 foot of water that covers an acre of land. So if you have an acre of land and you dig it 10 feet deep and that fills up with water, well, that is 10 acre feet of water. So imagine the 25,000 acre feet that is needed. And let's just say every basin that is built is 10 feet deep. Well, quick math, fortunately, I can do that math pretty quickly. That'd be 2,500 acres of land. Now, some of our basins can be a little bit deeper. It's all based on how deep Cypress Creek is. And so the deeper Cypress Creek is, the deeper our basins are, and the more water can be held there. And so in terms of the overall footprint, it really depends on where we're able to build those basins and how deep we can build them at the time.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Alan. Alan, I'm going to stay with you for our next question. You mentioned there are 3 categories of these grant funds, and Blair McPherson is asking if we're applying for Hurricane Harvey mitigation or only for 2015 and 2016 flood mitigation dollars.
So there's 2 parts to the question, and because I'm going to try and interpret that question a little bit. So you said Hurricane Harvey mitigation. It could be asking whether or not we had submitted for HMGP, that's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and that program unfortunately has already closed. In the sense of it receiving new applications, we did submit multiple applications, and some were accepted, but many were not. But I think you're really talking about that 3rd program, the Hurricane Harvey program, where the General Land Office has $2 billion to dole out, and that's a statewide competition. We are submitting applications to that program, but not in the Cypress Creek watershed, and that largely has to do with the low to moderate income requirements that are established in that program and in all of the CDBG-MIT programs. What we're trying to do is to balance the right size project with an area that does meet those requirements. And then the Harvey mitigation projects, those are much larger projects. Those are in the $100 million range, and it would not be possible to develop a $100 million project in the Cypress Creek watershed that also meets those LMI requirements for that funding. And so this was our way of targeting the Cypress Creek watershed with the right program and the right projects that we think we can move relatively quickly on.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alan. Jonathan, our next one's going to come to you. Jan S. says, wonderful projects at TC Jester and Westador, but regardless of upstream mitigation, everything ultimately flows east and bottlenecks at I-45 and Cypress Creek. What are the plans for this area? There's plenty of vacant land to obtain, and in fact, some is already owned by the county.
Yeah, so that is, as we talked about a little bit earlier, we are looking into potential projects in this area, but I will say that projects upstream of you do help. They do help to a certain extent, and so of course, depending on how far away you are, would depend on exactly what those benefits you would receive. But in general, detention basin upstream of you is going to help by reducing the flow that makes it downstream during a storm event. But I will add to that yes, these two projects are nice. But we do need projects and more and additional detention basins up and down the Cypress Creek watershed. Alan likened it to biting off pieces of an elephant, and I'll say it's everything is kind of like pieces to a puzzle. And so we are looking at those puzzle pieces in the area east of I-45. There, you're right, Harris County owns some land there, and we work with Harris County. You heard from Commissioner Cagle at the beginning, talking about how Harris County Precinct 4 works with us as partners on the Cypress Creek Greenway. And yes, Harris County does own some land along Cypress Creek, and we actually had a conversation with Harris County Precinct 4 Parks today on this very topics, talking through coordination on properties they own and where we can put detention basin projects. So those conversations are ongoing on many tracks up and down the Cypress Creek watershed, including east of I-45. And so part of our implementation plan is to put all that together and figure out where it makes the most sense to put these detention basins.
Great. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Always nice to see that watershed-wide perspective. Hani, I'm going to come to you for our next question. While the grant applications are pending, what's the next step for the two projects that we've discussed tonight?
Yes, thank you, Emily, for this question. Yeah, regarding the TC Juster is currently in the PER stage, and the next step would be the design stage for TC Juster Basin. And for Westador Basin, as we already stated previously, we are still in the early stage for this project. So we are currently selecting a consultant to start the PER stage for Westador Basin.
Thanks so much, Connie. That's really helpful. Okay, Tawana, I'm going to come over to you for our next question from Brian Mackey. He asks, once these basins are completed, who will ultimately be responsible for the long-term maintenance of these sites? He's talking about mowing, tree removal, and trash going out 5 to 10 to 20 years. Can you speak to how that process works?
So district has an infrastructure department that will be responsible for maintaining any of the infrastructure that belongs to Harris County Flood Control District. Should there be any partner amenities on any of these facilities, well, then that particular partner would be responsible for maintaining their amenities.
Thanks so much, Tawana. That's helpful. Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to come to you for our next one from David Taylor. He says, how will you get that amount of acre feet considering the dense population along the creek?
That is an excellent question. And I will ask you to stay tuned to about the spring, summer of 2021. And that will be when we receive the completion of the Cypress Creek program implementation plan from our consultant. That plan is being investigated right now, and our consultants are working hard to figure out the answer to that question because it is a good one, and it is a lot to figure out. And like I said, with the puzzle pieces we have to put together, there's a lot of work to do to tell us not only where all of this detention is going to happen, but how and how to do it efficiently.
Perfect. Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so Alan, I'm going to come to you for our next one. It's from Richard Murphy, and he's asking how many acre feet Parker Reservoir holds.
So a good question. You had me doing some quick Googling. I knew roughly what Addicks Reservoir was. It's a little more than 200,000 acre feet of water. And I can confirm that Barker capacity is also a little more than 200,000 acre feet, close to 209,000 acre feet of volume. So put that in perspective. There's more than 400,000 acre feet of volume between Barker and Addicks. And we're looking at 25,000 along Cypress Creek. So getting back to the challenges of where are we going to find that? We're going to look hard, but we're confident we'll be able to make it. But I hope that answers your question, Director Murphy.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, Tawana, I'm going to come to you for our next question from Jim Robertson. He's asking if there's a storage volume estimate for the basin on the west side of TC Jester.
Oh, that's a good question. Currently, we are planning an excavation and removal contract on the west side of TC Jester, which is where we contract with a construction company to excavate a minimum or a maximum volume. So that's just an excavation that will be much less than whatever the footprint of the basin will be. So we do not have an estimate for what the basin will hold once we get into a PER design phase for the west side of TC Jester. We're only limited at this time to a contract that will not excavate more than, I think it's 300 cubic yards within the 3-year period.
Got it. Thanks, Tawana. Okay, Jonathan, coming back to you with a question from Kathleen Broussard. She asks, from a flood control perspective, which project, TC Jester or Westador, takes chronological precedence? In other words, which project should be completed first? And some of that may be about logistics, but.
In the case of TC Jester and Westador, they can happen simultaneously. There is not one in this case that has to take chronological precedence. We are afforded the opportunity, as Alan mentioned early in the program, on the west side of TC Jester to utilize the ENR program, and that allows a dirt mining contractor to begin excavation now, and so that helps get things underway. But in terms of what may have to happen in any order for engineering efficiency, they can happen simultaneously.
Hey, Emily, let me add a little bit to that. So I want to compliment the question because there are definitely times when things do need to happen in a certain order. Usually that's the case where we're making improvements to a channel. And in doing so, if we were to just make improvements to a channel and make water move faster, well, that might help somebody upstream, but it would hurt somebody downstream. And we can't do that. We have to be able to mitigate any of those impacts. And that is, we don't transfer the risk from one place to another. So in cases where we're doing a channel improvement, oftentimes we will need to excavate a detention basin first, and then do the channel improvements. But in this case, they are separate but equal. And so what drives which basin goes first is really more along the lines of how can we get things moving quicker. And in the case of TC Jester, the restrictions are a little fewer and we're able to move quicker on that west side.
Great, thanks, Alan. And I'm going to stick with you for our next question, which comes from Blair McPherson. Can you talk about HUD's emphasis, and by HUD, that's Housing and Urban Development, which is where these funds, one of the agencies involved in these grant applications. But can you talk about their emphasis on serving underrepresented communities with CDBG-MIT funds and how you plan to address that in these two applications?
So it is an important element, and it's actually emphasized by both HUD and by GLO. So HUD provides the higher elevation guidance, if you will, and then the GLO puts a little bit more of a metric to it. They put a score to it. So the way these projects will be compared will not be done by flood control. It will be done by the GLO. And so they will take every project they receive, and they've published their scoring criteria. There's a total of 105 points that can be earned to prove the merits of a particular project. And 20 of those points, it's either 20 or 10, I apologize, you caught me off the top of my head, are specifically oriented towards social vulnerability index. And so the scoring of the area that is benefiting from the project will receive a certain amount of those points based on its SVI score, a composite score. And then equally, there are points awarded towards projects that are serving low to moderate income areas. And so between those two, they make up probably about a third to maybe a little bit more of the total score that a project has. And so it really sets the stage for making sure that the projects that receive the CDBG-MIT fund do genuinely have benefit to areas with a higher SVI and with LMI areas.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alan. Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to come to you for our next one. David Taylor says that at the beginning we mentioned 144 bond projects are underway. Can you clarify, are there only 2 that are related to Cypress Creek flooding?
Well, there are more than that, and there's one really important bond project that should be mentioned, and that is what I talked about earlier. In that there's a bond project that is $100 million towards land acquisition for purpose of floodplain preservation in the Cypress Creek watershed, and that's a huge number, first of all, but a huge part of what will be a number of projects. And so no, the bond program does expand to many more than just the 2.
Great. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Alan, I'm coming to you for the next one. We have a question from Paul Fabian about how much of the 25,000 acre feet we expect to be completed with the bond fund money that was approved.
So a good question, and I don't have a good guess on that, but I do have a relatively good guess on what it would cost to build all of it. And that's a big, big number. 25,000 acre feet might cost anywhere between $600 and $900 million. The reason it costs that much is not just digging dirt. We also have to acquire right-of-way, and that's why I can't give a good estimate on how much of that we'll be able to do with the bond, because in many cases we don't have right-of-way yet, and we're not real sure how much it's gonna cost. In some cases, and it's difficult to find right-of-way for acquisition up and down Cypress Creek. And in many cases, the only way we'll be able to acquire large chunks would ultimately be through the condemnation process, and that can get extremely expensive. So where we have volunteer or opportunistic acquisitions, those are the ones we want to acquire very quickly, such as through the funding portion of the bond program that Jonathan talked about a minute ago. That $100 million toward floodplain preservation along Cypress Creek. Well, we've already identified a couple of those right-of-way, those tracts that we recently acquired that can move into some form of excavation and removal. So it's hard to say how far we'll get. I got a pretty good idea that it's going to cost well over $500 million to get to the 25,000 acre foot goal. But like I said, we're going to eat an elephant one bite at a time and start building as much detention as we possibly can, and take that as far as the funds will take us, and then we'll start seeking other people's money for additional partnership opportunities.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. We're running out of time, a little low on time, I should say. So I'm going to stay with you for our next question, but I'm going to combine a few folks' questions that are on similar themes. So we've heard from Zach Rosen, Charles Miller, Kathleen, who we mentioned earlier, Zach Rosen, sorry, I already mentioned him, and Ken Barrett, all asking for a little bit more clarification on the ultimate design for the basin at TC Jester, and any considerations for vegetation, natural features, trails, and any major differences or unique features compared to other detention basins in the county. Can you just speak to that for us?
Sure. And this really gets to the preliminary engineering part. We haven't worked out those specific details yet. And what we like to do, again, is to compare a couple of different alternatives. And so in the case of TC Jester, for example, we have 3 different possible designs. And I like to challenge my team to look at bookends, really. And so on the one hand, they look at maximizing volume. How can we get every single cubic inch of volume out of this basin? And on the other end of the bookend, we say, well, look, there are some things that may be pretty important to this community, such as trails. And so we say, what if we went a little overboard and said, let's put all possible opportunities for recreation in this option. And then we'll also have one in the middle that kind of tries to strike that balance. So that way we have the numbers, we have the science and the analysis that says, if we just gave so much more of the property over to recreation, we might lose 50% of the potential volume. And that's where then we have to compare, well, we have flood control owned property, we have a great need for detention. How much of that in this particular basin are we willing to give up? Is the community willing to give up in order to preserve some of those other elements? Now that's really focusing on the recreational side, but I also want to talk a little bit on the environmental side. So oftentimes, and of course, flood control is part of what's called an MS4 permit for the region. And so every project that we build is obligated to try to incorporate stormwater quality treatment in those projects. And so oftentimes we'll find that building a basin with a wet bottom does two things. First of all, it makes the bottom of the basin flat, more volume, but it also provides an opportunity for water that comes in to run through a treatment train, through certain wetlands plants that can help treat that water and make it better when it gets back into Cypress Creek. So those are a lot of the things that we balance as we're working through the PER process. So long way of saying, I don't have the answers now, but we want your feedback. We're interested in what you want to see in this basin, so we can try and find that right balance between volume and what the community is asking for.
Thanks, Alan. That's really helpful. I'm going to close this out with two final questions as we're already a little bit over, but I think these two are really, really important. So Jim Robertson asked, or he said, it's good to see basin planning and design moving forward for these two basins while the implementation plan is being developed. Jonathan, can you speak to whether we see any other basins or projects moving forward before that plan is completed?
Yes, Jim, I think that can happen. And a lot of it may depend on what happens with our Champions Detention Basin. I know a lot of you are interested in that. And so that, of course, depends on the acquisition of that and what happens there. So that may be the next one that can move forward. And then the rest of them all depend on land acquisition. So the short answer is, yeah, I think a couple of these can move forward before the implementation plan is completed.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Alan, our final question is going to come to you. We had someone ask what the public's role in these grant applications look like.
Good question, because we're out here talking with y'all. The public's role is to provide feedback. So what we do, and we're doing these meetings for two reasons. First, because it's the right thing to do. It's important to seek community input, and we want to make sure that the community supports the work we're doing. But second, in the case of these CDBG-MIT applications, it's actually a requirement. The GLO has said you need to reach out, document that you have done so, document the public's feedback as part of this application. So whether you support the project, whether you don't support the project, whether you think that we need to build lots of trails or build no trails, those are important elements that GLO wants to know that we have heard your feedback, and where appropriate, we've been able to incorporate those into what we ultimately would do with money from the GLO. So that's the role, is to let us know, but also let the state know whether or not you support this, because that can go a long way to providing a project and grant funding that we so desperately need out here.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. And that feels like a good note to end our conversation tonight on. As I mentioned earlier, we will be following up with anyone whose question or comment was not addressed during tonight's session to make sure that we are getting back to everyone. But also to build on what Alan just said, community engagement and your feedback really is a critical part of what we are doing with these grant applications. And we encourage you to tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your family. Visit the flood control website, learn more about these projects and others. When the public comment period officially launches, we'll be letting everyone know, and we welcome your feedback as those are posted as well. So with that, I hope everyone stays safe, stays dry, and has a wonderful rest of the week. Thanks so much.